Okay, now we're live on Facebook as well. So I would like to welcome all the audience to our last session, not only of the day, but also of the conference. Sadly, everything that has a beginning must end. So my name is Jimmy Vera, and I will be chairing this session. So I would like to remind the audience of Zoom that you need to have your microphones muted and your cameras turned off during the presentation. Also, for the audience following our Facebook transmission, don't forget to leave your comments and also your questions, as there will be a moment for Q&A after the presentation. So I'm going to give you a small biography of our presenter today. Mr. Ruslan Suvorov is an assistant professor in applied linguistics at the University of Western Ontario, Canada, where he teaches courses in second language assessment and computer-assisted language learning. His research interests lie at the intersection of language testing assessment, computer-assisted language learning, and instructional technology and design, with a particular focus on second language listening and the application of eye tracking in language assessment context. He has given numerous presentations and workshops at various regional, national, and international conferences and published in Language Testing, Calico Journal, Canadian Journal of Applied Linguistics, TESL EJ, as well as in edited volumes, conference proceedings, encyclopedias, and research reports. He is also a co-author of Blended Language Program Evaluation, Palgrave Macmillan, 2016. So we welcome Professor Suvorov from Western Canada University. Would like to remind the presenter to stick to the allotted time so that we can have a nourished Q&A session at the end of the presentation. So, Ruslan, the stage is yours.
Thank you, Jimmy, for the introduction, and thank you everyone who is joining this session, the last session today. I would first like to start by saying that I would like to thank Dr. Cárdenas-Claros for inviting me to give this talk, and also thank all the committee members and everyone who is involved in the conference organization for putting this together. I know it's a challenging and time-consuming endeavor, so everything you've been doing behind the scenes are greatly appreciated, so thank you. All right, so the topic of my talk today is technology in L2 listening assessment, current trends and future directions. So I will start by giving a brief overview of technology use in L2 listening, and then I will focus on talking about technology in L2 listening assessment from the perspective of three functions, namely enabling, enhancing, and transforming. And then I will also give some ideas about future directions in this area, in the area of technology use in listening assessment. So just a brief overview of listening. As we all know, this is oftentimes cited as the least understood and under-researched skill for a variety of reasons. It is complex, it is covert, fugacious, so we can't really measure or capture it directly, unlike other skills. It cannot be directly observed or measured. However, it is an important skill because as research shows, up to 45% of our communication time is spent using this skill, listening. And these days, listening is inextricably linked to technology. It enables what is called disembodied language. So since we started using technology, it's the first time when we can produce the language and it can be recorded, saved and preserved for a later consumption by someone else later. So a brief overview of technology use in listening. I guess the first uses of technology for listening instruction started at the beginning of the 20th century, shortly after the first phonographs were invented at the end of the 19th century. So at that time, it was the era of the natural method, direct method, Berlitz methods that focused on the use of authentic language, on listening and speaking. So the use of these first phonographs that were capable of producing the sound, the recorded sound, were basically the first uses of technology for listening. The focus on Audio became, I guess, more prominent in the 50s with the arrival of the audiolingual method. And that was the time when language labs started to pop up, at least across the universities in North America, using reel-to-reel audio tapes, eventually switching to cassette audio tapes, and then to first computers, microcomputers. So these technologies, these reel-to-reel audio tapes, they allowed the learners to engage in these drill and practice exercises by listening and repeating, listening and repeating. And then when the first microcomputers arrived in the 70s, in addition to audio, or educators were able to use video on top of that. So the first microcomputers, like here you have, you see Apple II that came out in 1977, the first satellite TV, video discs, VHS tapes, they all gave rise to the use of video for listening instruction. And then with the arrival of the World Wide Web in the 90s, it was definitely a new era and new opportunities for using technology in listening emerged as well. So all these developments in technology, of course, led to changes in how we conduct the assessment of listening. In my discussion of how technology can be used in listening assessment, I decided to structure this discussion around these three main functions: enabling function, enhancing, and transforming. So I'll start with the enabling function of technology. So technology, we can use technology as a tool to provide access to the assessments, to the listening assessments, and we can also use technology for delivering listening assessments. So a simple example would be putting a listening test on a computer, a computerized listening test, where we can deliver the prompts, the stimuli, whether they are in the audio-only format or the audio-visual format, via a computer. So technology affords that. We can also create test items on a computer for assessing listening that can be automatically scored, such as multiple choice items, one of the most commonly used item formats for assessing listening. But in addition to providing access to computerized listening tests, we can also use technology to create multimodal input for it to be used in listening tests. And yesterday, for those of you who attended the second plenary, you heard quite a lot about multimodal input, and audiovisual input is part of that. So technology allows us to use, for example, videos and embed them into listening tests so that the learners can listen and answer the questions. So to demonstrate the enabling function of technology, I added a few screenshots. This is a screenshot from a video-based academic listening test. Here you can see a video prompt. So technology allows us to control who plays the video, how many times it is played. In this case, the test taker who's taking this listening test is not able to control the number of times that the video is played. It is played automatically. And once the video finishes playing, the test taker can click on the next button and move to the next page. So in addition to the video prompt, we can see here an example of a multiple choice item created in for a listening test. So again, a test taker can choose an option, click submit and move on. And technology allows us to control not only, well, it not only gives us access, enables access and provides delivery, but it also allows us to make decisions about the test administration method. So we can, for example, make decisions as to whether we want to display the prompt or the stimulus and the questions at the same time. So that will be while listening assessment, or whether we want to show the prompt, audiovisual prompt or audio-only prompt first and then show the questions and items afterwards, which would be an example of the post-listening test. We can also leverage technology to determine whether we want the test takers to interact with all items at the same time, or whether we want the test to be designed in a linear fashion so that they can see only one item at a time and move forward, as opposed to having access to all the items and answer them in random order. So all those decisions, of course, have to be based on the purposes of the assessment, whether it is used for high stakes assessment purposes or for more low stakes like classroom-based assessment. Okay, another function is enhancing function of technology. So what technology allows us to do now is it basically expands the capabilities, the functionality of the listening assessment. So when we use technology in this manner, we can do some things that we cannot do when we assess listening without technology, for example, in a paper-based format. So one good example of the enhancing function of technology is the use of computer adaptive tests. And I'll show some examples in a second. Another example is the computerized dynamic assessment of listening comprehension. And again, I'll show some examples in a minute. And the third, I guess, example of this enhancing function of technology is the use of innovative item types, such as items where the questions are embedded directly into the, or imprinted directly into the stimulus, audiovisual stimulus. So computer adaptive tests, or CATs as they are known, they've been around since the 80s. At some point, they were used in high stakes tests such as TOEFL, I think CBT, but then it was dropped, and to my knowledge, TOEFL IBT right now does not use computer adaptive tests. Other tests such as Duolingo, for example, English test, they do, and I think Pearson Test of English Academic also uses computer adaptive test items. So the idea behind the computer adaptive test is that instead of giving the same set of items to all the test takers, you start with an item of, let's say, an average difficulty level. So let's say it's like 0.5. And then depending on whether the test taker answers the item correctly or incorrectly, the next item will depend on the answer to this first item. So if a test taker responds to item 1 correctly, then the next item will be selected by the computer. That item will be of a higher difficulty level. If, however, the test taker answers the original item incorrectly, then he or she will be given an item of an easier level, and then so on and so forth. So basically, the computer, or not the computer, delivery system adapts the complexity of the items, subsequent items, based on how well or how poorly a learner or a test taker performs on the previous items. So this approach is used in Duolingo English test. Many of you probably have heard of it. I think it's become particularly popular since the start of the pandemic, when lots of testing centers that administer IELTS, TOEFL, IBT were shut down, and you can take Duolingo English tests on your computer at home. So I know that lots of universities started to accept Duolingo English test scores for admission purposes. So Duolingo English test has 3 types of listening items. They're listening and select items. Here you have a screenshot. So basically the idea is that the test taker has to listen and click on each word, hear the audio of the word, and then decide as to whether the item is a real English word or not. Another type is the listening and type items. So here, the test taker has to type what they hear in the text box. And then another example is the listen and speak items. So these last 2 item types are basically integrated item types. where they listen to the prompt and then they have to say it, repeat it. So basically it's a yeah, listen and speak item type. Okay, and then what I assume is happening in the background is, depending on how well or how poorly a test taker performs, the next item that he or she is provided is based on whether the difficulty level of the following items are dependent on the performance on the initial items. Okay, another type where enhancing function of technology comes into play is the computerized dynamic assessment. Matthew Perner is one of the I guess people who have been doing a lot of research in this area, and I'm going to show you an example and briefly explain how computerized dynamic assessment works. So in a computerized dynamic assessment, you basically create a listening test. It can be any test, but in this case, we're talking about listening tests. You create a test, and you built in different types of feedback, from very implicit to very explicit. So here we have a screenshot. It's a Chinese listening comprehension. So what a test taker has to do is listen to the following audio that can be played twice, and then when it ends, they have to proceed to the questions. So they see a question, what does the man want to do? And they have 5 options. So let's say they choose option A, and that's not a correct option. So what the system will tell you, the test will tell you, is give you very implicit, I guess, feedback saying that this is not the correct answer, listen again. So the test taker would listen again, and then the second time, when he or she chooses the incorrect answer, instead of just saying that the answer is incorrect, the system will provide some more kind of explicit feedback, saying like, did you hear, sorry, I cannot read Chinese, but there is a prompt here, a more explicit prompt. So then the test taker can give it another try. If on the third try, the answer is again incorrect, the feedback becomes even more explicit. And then on the last attempt, again, if they answer it incorrectly, the system will directly say that the correct answer is E, and this is why. This is why E is the correct answer. So you can create such computerized dynamic assessment to really enable, I guess, practice, listening practice in class. It's time consuming, but it's supposedly very effective, because instead of just telling the learner that the answer is incorrect or giving the correct answer, you kind of go through these steps of providing different levels of feedback in terms of how explicit or implicit it is, so that the learner can learn in the process and hopefully develop his or her listening comprehension. Another example of how the enhancing function of technology is used is to use the items directly imprinted into the prompts, audiovisual prompts. In this case, we have an example of a video, YouTube, where the person who designed the assessment embedded the test items related to this audiovisual prompt directly into the audiovisual prompt. So as a learner or as a test taker, you don't have to go to attend to 2 different places. If we're talking about while listening assessment, you have your stimulus and your items in the same place. So here the question or the item, the test item, is just embedded as a caption into the video. Another a little bit more sophisticated way of doing that is to use tools such as H5P. It's a HTML5 package, which allows you to add interactivity into the video by embedding these different types of items, and not just items, actually any type of content. So here we have an example where a video. I can actually, no, I guess I cannot play it because I don't have the browser. I'm not sharing a browser with you. The video it's a lecture from psychology is played, and then at certain points in the video, if you can see these circles here, the video pauses and a question appears on the screen. So a test taker would just read the question, click on the answer, and continue the test. H5P, for example, can be used not only for this linear type of assessment, but you can create loops where, let's say, if a learner answers the item incorrectly, he or she is taken back to the beginning of the video to rewatch that specific clip, that specific episode, and try it again. So it's kind of resembles the computerized dynamic assessment in a way that you're kind of providing additional scaffolding to the learner, such as replaying the input so that they can try again and see if they can answer the question correctly. And the types of questions that you can embed are not just multiple choice questions. They can be also open-ended questions. Okay, and then the third function of technology that I would like to talk about is the transforming function. So this is where technology is used and not just to create some additional affordances, but it actually has a kind of it creates new transformative possibilities for listening assessment. And I think right now we're at a stage where this transforming function of technology reveals itself more in research on listening assessment as opposed to the actual listening assessment instruments. But I think we'll get to where it is also in the future, in the near future, we will get to the point where it is also performs the transforming function in the actual listening assessment instruments. And I'll talk about that in a minute when I talk about the future directions. So examples of how technology can performs this transforming function in L2 listening assessment include things like eye tracking research, which allows us to look at not just at the outcomes of the listening assessment, not just at the product, the scores, but also take a look into the processes, how the learners actually, what they do while they're taking the listening test or the listening assessment, how they interact with the test items, how they interact with the prompts, audio or audio-visual prompts. So basically they're cognitive processes and test-taking strategies. So eye tracking has been used a little bit. It's, as you know, it's been gaining a lot of traction in applied linguistics in general over the past decade, but it's also been used in some studies on listening assessment. Specifically, there are some studies that looked at how the test takers interact with the audio-visual input in video-based listening tests. So Aaron Batty and I both did such studies. I'll talk about, actually I'm going to talk about another study, but he, for example, looked at how the test takers interact with different types of visual cues in the videos that they watch before answering the items. Another way to use eye tracking is to look at the test-taking strategies, as well as the cognitive processes that the learners or the test takers go through while they're taking a listening test. Another example of this transforming function of technology is to use electroencephalography, EEG, to explore the cognitive states. So I did a study a couple of years ago where I used this technology to look at the cognitive states of engagement and interest, test takers' engagement and interest while they were completing a video-based listening test. And in a recent study, Vahid Aryadus and his colleagues used functional near-infrared spectroscopy imaging to investigate the effects of two test methods, while listening and post-listening, and gender, as well as gender, on the listening ability of the test takers and their brain activation under these two conditions. So I'll talk a little bit more about two of these studies in more detail. So in the study that I did a couple of years ago, I basically used a combination of eye tracking and verbal report methods to examine the use of test-taking strategies by the learners or the test takers who took the Michigan English test. And it was a computer-delivered version of that test. And while they were not just listening test items, they were also reading items. There was a combination of both. It applies to, I guess, to this talk. So one of the things that I found, or what eye tracking allowed me to find out, is that the test scores on the Michigan English test, which were based on the multiple choice items, did not quite match the what I called the real scores. If you take into account the use of test wiseness strategies that the learners use when they answer the test items, then the actual scores that they get do not quite represent what they really know. So eye tracking allowed me to determine which of the test items the test takers answered randomly, or using what we call test wiseness strategies. As you know, in a multiple choice item, you can just choose an option randomly without really knowing the answer. So by combining the eye tracking data, which allowed me to see how the test takers interacted with each item, how much time, for example, they spend reading a prompt or the stem and the options. If they, for example, change their answers, like let's say they can read options A, B, C, D, choose option A, and then switch to option C, and spend like 2 minutes on that item going back and forth. That eye tracking data can give an indication that a test taker is apparently struggling. And if you combine that eye tracking data with the verbal data, asking the test taker to explain how he or she answered that item, why he or she chose that answer, how confident he or she is that that's the correct answer, that can give you provide you insights into these cognitive underlying processes and the test-taking strategies that this specific test taker used to answer this item. So if this item was answered using test wiseness strategies, such as random guessing, this type of, so eye tracking can help you determine that. So, and what I found was that in general, the multiple choice format seemed to be conducive to the selection of answers by guessing, especially for lower level test takers. So it's not just enough to look at the test scores on a multiple choice listening test. It is also important to look into these processes that lead to those scores. Another example is a study that uses electroencephalography. So in this study, I used Emotive Epoch Plus, which is a wireless EEG headset. What it does, it records signals from the brain, and you can the software that comes with this device measures 6 different cognitive states. And in my study, so this is a picture of a test taker wearing this EEG set. And on the computer screen, you can see some of the data that it records. So what I did was I looked at how the data from EEG, specifically the data about the test takers' cognitive states of engagement and interest while they were completing the listening test, correlates with their perceptual data. So with their with the reported data of how engaged or interested they felt during that test, and specifically while answering each item and watching each video prompt. And I found that the data that for some measures, for example, for the measure of interest, cognitive state of interest, the self-reported data, so how the test takers felt they interested were, and the data from EEG, there was a pretty significant correlation. But on the other hand, there was no, for example, correlation between the self-reported measures of engagement and the EEG-derived measures of engagement. I also found that there was no, for example, significant relationship between these measures of interest and engagement as measured by the EEG during the test and the participants' scores on that test. So it didn't really matter how engaged or how interested they were. It didn't really affect didn't really have any implications for their test scores. There was no relationship between those two measures. However, I did find out that the engagement levels, for instance, had a direct impact on the performance of all of the participants except for one, but there was no such impact of the interest levels. All right, so now where does all of this take us? So here are some of my thoughts on where I think where technology will be in the context of listening assessment and how it can be leveraged in the near future. So if we think about the classroom-based assessment, one thing we need to keep in mind that no matter how we decide to use technology for assessment, the technology-enhanced assessment should reflect how technology-enhanced listening is learned. That is how we use technology for teaching and learning listening. So it can be argued that technology affects how language use, how we use the language these days, and technology has actually has been making significant changes to how we use the languages. If we think about our language use, for example, 100 years ago versus how we use language now, using mobile devices, using computers, that's changed. I mentioned earlier this concept of disembodied language, where we can now, using technology, we can record a message for someone and send that message either in the audio or video format, and that person can listen to that message later. So the language becomes disembodied in the sense that the speaker or the person who produces that sentence or that utterance, that language, is time-wise is divorced from that message. So in the past, when there was no technology, in order to hear something, you had to listen to a specific person who would say that utterance. Right now, you don't have to be physically and temporarily in the same space. There can be a distance, both in terms of physical distance and time distance, between the sender of the message and the recipient of the auditory message or audio-visual message. So one of the ways, or one of the, I guess, avenues where technology, I think, will play an important role in listening assessment is the creation of these innovative item types, specifically interactive multimodal items. So I showed earlier an example of how that can be done in H5P, and I'm confident that there will be more sophisticated tools emerging in the next few years that will allow to create really interactive multimodal input that can be used both for teaching and for assessing listening. And then also with the rise of mobile devices, the mobile assisted listening assessment, I think, is another venue that can be used where the classroom-based listening assessment will go. So the idea of micro-learning, learning in small chunks, learning anywhere, any place on the go, and as well as doing a micro-assessment is something that I think will become more prevalent in the near future. If we think in terms of the high-stakes assessment, one of the venues that I think are really exciting, and I'm pretty sure we'll get there soon, is the use of process tracing technologies, so that we assess not only the product, that we don't only focus on the scores, which is what we're doing right now. Most of the assessment that we do is based on most of the interpretations that we make about the students' listening abilities are based on their test scores, especially if we talk about high stakes assessment. But those test scores, those results do not take into account everything that happens before, up until the point where students arrive at those scores. So the example that I gave earlier, where test takers can, for instance, use random guessing to answer multiple choice question, the score itself is not going to reflect that. You need to actually have some way of recording how the test takers respond to those multiple choice items in order to be able to detect whether there is this random guessing or the use of other test wiseness strategies takes place or not. And there are some, so one of the ways that can be done is, I think, through built-in eye trackers. So right now, our computers that we use, most of them have built-in web cameras. It's kind of becoming a norm. I think that at some point in the future, it will be possible, both from the technological point of view and also from the financial point of view, to build in eye trackers into the either computers or whatever machines devices that we use for high stakes listening assessment. So I can imagine that testing centers, like right now, that administer TOEFL, IBT, or IELTS, they can use computers with built-in eye trackers that will record how the test takers interact with the items during the listening assessment, and not just listening assessment, any type of assessment of any scale, and use those data, factor it into the calculating the results, in addition to just looking at the test scores. Other examples of such process tracing technologies would be the use of keystroke logging. Evgeny Chukharev, who did lining at Iowa State University, and his research team, they've been doing this research in the context of writing, specifically looking at the underlying processes that the learners engage in when they write, let's say, write an academic paper. So they combine keystroke logging with eye tracking data to gain insights into how the learners actually produce their texts, like their papers. And of course, I think the use of big data and user analytics to inform the results of the listening assessment is another venue. Another example, which already exists, is that specifically in the context of multimodal or audiovisual listening assessment, all the research that is out there right now looks at how the test takers perform on audiovisual listening tests versus audio-only listening tests. And oftentimes the conclusions about whether we should use visuals in listening assessment and to what extent they affect the test taker's performance is based on the underlying assumption that if a test taker performs better on an audio-visual test as opposed to the audio-only test, that should be attributed to the effect of visuals, and that's why we should use them. I mean, if they facilitate, if they increase the test performance. But the issue with that assumption is that assumption does not take into account whether the test takers actually look at that audiovisual prompt. They might very well just close their eyes during the video, like a video lecture, and listen to it and then respond to the question. So if they perform better on such a video-based test as opposed to an audio-only test, it cannot be attributed to the effect of visual. So we need to measure actually the extent to which the test takers interact with that visual input. But apart from measuring the extent to which they interact with the visual input, it is more important to look at actually the visual complexity of videos. And that's something that hasn't been done up until, I guess, to my knowledge, Emad Al-Ghamdi's work, his recent dissertation, is the first example where that type of research has been done. And he in particular worked with Paul Gruber and other people to create this automated video analysis software that allows you to analyze the visual complexity of a specific video clip. And depending on that should be the visual complexity of the video input should be taken into account when we design video-based listening assessments, because if the visual complexity of a video is very high, that will definitely affect the performance, and it might be not just related to the listening comprehension, but what we can call viewing comprehension as well. Okay, I think I'm out of time, 40 minutes. So thank you very much for listening to me. We have, I think, plenty of time for questions and hopefully some answers, if I have any.
Thank you very much, Ruslan, for a highly insightful presentation. I would like to turn to the audience now, and please feel free to turn your cameras and open your microphones if you have any question for the presenter. All right, it will be better maybe if you ask the question personally. So we have a hand raised. We have Diego. Diego, yes, you may ask your question. Diego?
I think he was clapping.
Oh, so it was not really a question. All right. So,
no.
Okay, so maybe more people have questions for Ruslan. Camilo Ramos, yes.
Yeah, thank you, Ruslan, for a very insightful presentation. It was very comprehensive, and quite updated in terms of technology and listening, which I think is really, really relevant. And I guess I'd like to hear your thoughts on the extent to which English variations are making their way into the assessment of L2 listening as a result of the use of technology. I see personally attention there, but I'd like to hear your thoughts. Especially I'm thinking from a perspective of English as a lingua franca, or maybe English as spoken by non-native speakers.
So your question is, to which extent, in my opinion, the kind of less standard varieties of English are making
their way into the assessment, yeah.
Well, if we're talking about high stakes assessment, I guess from what I see, if we look at the most common high stakes tests like IELTS, TOEFL, IBT, Pearson Test of English Academic, they do have, well, I think TOEFL IBT is purely American English, but IELTS and I believe PTE Academic, they do have varieties. They do integrate some varieties, different accents, I would say, but in general, it all stands within this, within the range of standards dialects, right? And then the question is like, okay, if we think about social equity, on the one hand, we want more diversity, but on the other hand, we need to keep in mind, I think, what is the purpose of that assessment? Specifically, which construct of listening that test is designed to measure. And I think if with tests like IELTS and TOEFL IBT, because they're primarily used for, well, TOEFL IBT is used mostly in North American contexts for enrollment purposes. IELTS is used more, I guess, widely, not just for academic purposes, but also for immigration purposes in many different countries, English-speaking countries. On the one hand, you want, I think, if you think in terms of social equity, on the one hand, you want diversity, right? But on the other hand, if we start introducing less common, not dialects, but like varieties of English, then it will maybe benefit one group of test takers, but not the other. So then, you know, by trying to eliminate one problem, we will create another problem. So I guess it's kind of a long answer, but to answer your question, I feel like there isn't really much variety in high stakes tests, and I'm not sure there is an easy solution to that, because if companies start introducing that variety, that will probably create these new problems. maybe that variety should be taken into account for like more localized tests. Yeah.
Okay. Yes. Thank you. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Camilo. Thank you, Ruslan, for your answer as well. Do we have more questions for Ruslan's presentation?
Yeah, thank you very much for such interesting talk. I have a question that is in relation to the multiple choice answers. You mentioned that we can use, of course, the technology to implement it for listening purposes. But my question is basically about how many, well, when we are listening, we have the capacity to retain from approximately 4 or 7 units of meaning in our memory. But when we are reading the multiple choice questions, what is or how can we manage this issue? Because sometimes it might be that the learner is not getting the right answers because he has a lot of information because of the reading that he is storing in the mind. And at the same time, he's also listening and trying to keep the information of the oral information. So how can we manage that? Is there like a specific number of multiple answers that we have to consider? Or how long should be each of the propositions? Or how can we manage this issue? Any suggestion, please?
Good question. I don't know. Well, I don't think there is one straightforward answer to that. A lot depends on what is the purpose of the assessment in which these multiple choice items are used? B, what is the level, the proficiency level of the test takers, right? The issue I think that you mentioned would be more of an issue when you assess lower level test takers that might have, for example, some listening skills, but have very poor reading skills. And if a multiple choice item is presented in a written format in the target language, then they might not, for example, they might have a cognitive overload where they have to keep in memory, in their short-term memory, what they've just heard in the audio or audiovisual prompt and read and process this written text. One of the ways I saw people working around that is to present those test items, if we are talking about multiple choice items, written items, to lower level students in their native language. So instead of creating an item in the target language, you would create it in their native language, so that they won't have to also translate and think what they've just read. Other ways would be to, I guess, just use other item types where they don't have to, that do not require a lot of reading. So it could be, I don't know, with lower level learners, you can have, a set of images and they have to click and select the one that is correct. So instead of using words, you rely more on the visuals to ask those questions.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Graciela, for your question. So we have more hands raised. We have Sebastian Adaros.
Thank you. I found it really interesting when you mentioned that we can use eye tracking in order to figure out in multiple choice items whether the participant is asking based on his or her understanding or actually just on test-taking strategies. And especially because in testing, it's particularly hard, in my opinion, to strike a good balance between the test being practical and fair, and on the other hand, being authentic and really showing what the test taker is able to do. So I would be really interested in hearing your views on how the insights gained from this data can be used in order to improve testing.
Good question. I guess, well, one way these data can be used to improve testing is to, as you know, like with multiple choice items, usually if we talk about high stakes tests, test development companies invest a lot of time in, psychometric research, analyzing those items, to you basically applying advanced statistical methods to see how well those items function or not, whether we need to revise an item or not. But I feel like no matter how advanced the statistical methods you use to, for example, calculate or measure the extent of guessing that potentially comes into play, it's all kind of indirect. Those are all indirect measures. With eye tracking data, you can obtain more direct, more cogent evidence of those test taking or the use of test wiseness strategies that are construct irrelevant. We don't want the learners to use those. So I think these data can inform the design and development of tests in the future or the revision of the existing tests. It is, however, as you mentioned, the striking a balance is difficult because it's really time consuming to collect these types of process-oriented data. And it's time consuming to analyze it because just eye tracking data by itself doesn't really tell you much. It just shows you the recording of the eye movements. You typically have to triangulate it and complement it with verbal data. So you, the way this type of research is usually done is that you would replay the eye movement, the recording of the eye movements to the test taker immediately after they finish the test and ask them some guiding questions as to why they interacted with the item that way, why did they choose a specific option, whether they are confident or not that that's the correct answer. So then you have more, I guess you can make more informed decisions as to whether a specific item needs to be revised or not. Okay, thank you. Good
All
question.
right. Thank you, Sebastian, for your question. We have Moises. Moises next for another question. We have another hand raised.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes,
Yes.
perfectly.
Thanks for your presentation. It was very interesting. My question pertains to some of your own findings that you reported on slide 29, I believe. I was wondering if we could look at it again.
Let me reshare the screen. Oops. 29, there you are.
Yeah. So there are two findings there that are hard for me to reconcile, and I think it's just because of the way that they are worded. So on the second bullet point, you wrote that there was no significant relationship. So third bullet point, there was no significant relationship between the EEG measure of interest and engagement and the performance of the participants. But then on the next bullet point, you wrote that engagement levels had a direct impact on the performance of all but one participant. So I have a hard time putting those two together because they seem to run counter to one another. So I was wondering if you could say more about that. Thanks.
Yes, good point. I'm trying to, just give me a second. Let me reread. So yeah, the third one, so yeah, they do sound contradicting. Significant relationship between measures of interest and the participant's performance. Yeah, I don't quite remember. I assume, so this was a study I did a few years ago. I assume that I might have measured the relationship. So the third bullet point maybe is looking at the relationship between interest and engagement and performance, all three, whereas the next bullet point is just engagement and performance. So yeah, that's the only thing that comes to my mind. But honestly, I don't remember. I would need to look back at the study, and it does sound like they're contradicting. I agree with you.
Okay, thanks. And also about one of the findings on this slide, you wrote that on the second bullet point, you wrote that no significant relationship between the EEG-derived and self-reported measures of engagement were found. So do you think this means that the learners, the listeners, were not aware of their own engagement?
I think what it means is that, as you probably know, the one of the criticism of the use of verbal report methodologies is that they are prone to reactivity and veridicality risks or non-veridicality risks. In other words, when we use verbal report methodologies, one issue is that the learners might say that they did or thought something, whereas in reality they did not. So what they're saying or what they think they did might not really reflect what they actually did or thought. And another thing is that the task itself, so in this case, well, not in this case, but let's say when you use like eye tracking data to, or the recording of the eye movements to prompt students or test takers' verbalizations, that can create an additional task. So it would be the reactivity risk. So I think what this finding shows is that how the test takers felt they were engaged in this listening test did not quite match how the cognitive state of engagement as operationalized by the software was recorded through the EEG device. So, and it's hard to, one of the issues with this that I encountered in this specific study was that the company that provided that software that measured those 6 cognitive states, including the state of interest and the state of engagement, did not really explain how they calculate, like what goes into calculating or into measuring this interest, right, or this engagement. So, and without knowing that information, because it's like proprietary, right? The companies make money. Without really knowing how they measure these 2 states, it's hard to know whether it is the students whose reported perception of how they how engaged they were was different from how they actually felt engaged, or whether there is an issue with the software that it doesn't really measure the engagement in the same way that the students feel they were engaged. And it's also like, you know, when you're asked about how engaged you are, you can, you know, for you as a person who is asked that question, you can think of engagement in one way.
Different
you can
ways.
or conceptualize it in one way, whereas another person will think about it. For someone else, engagement might mean a little bit different thing. I did explain, I did define these terms at the beginning of the study. I explained to them what I meant by interest and what I meant by engagement, so that it would be more or less consistent across the participants. But because of this difference, yeah, so I hope that answers your question as to why there was no relationship between these 2.
Yeah, it does. Thank you so much.
Okay, you're welcome. Good question. Yeah, I should look into this, the 3rd and 4th bullet point. Yeah, I don't remember, but it does sound like it's a bit contradictory here.
Thanks.
Yep.
All right. Thank you very much, Moises, for your question. Thank you, Ruslan, as well for the answer. Do we have more questions for Ruslan?
Roxana raised her hand.
Yes, yes, I raised. Okay, thanks. Hi, Ruslan. Well, I have been using a lot the text-to-speech tools, but specifically for developing speaking skills. Do you think that there can be useful too for developing listening skills? And what kind of suggestion can you give us to use them properly?
Text-to-speech tools to develop listening skills. I think there is well, I think there should definitely be some pedagogical applications. I never used text-to-speech tools.
Are those who are in the navigators, where when you want not to read, you prefer that the system reads for you aloud when you are in a website? Some of them are incorporated in the navigators. So just a question if you can see any kind of a usefulness for them to develop listening.
For listening, yeah, I guess if you want to provide additional listening input, that's probably a good way. But those tools, I mean, depending on the underlying text-to-speech engine, they might sound quite robotic and not very authentic. So listening is not just about, you know, enunciating each vowel, consonant, word correctly, but it's also about intonation and pitch and all those things. And I'm not sure that text-to-speech can really mimic though well. From my experience with text-to-speech tools, they're quite monotonous and somewhat artificial sounding, but that doesn't mean that they can't have practical applications in a classroom.
Okay, thank you.
I've never used them, so I can't really say much.
All right. Thanks, Roxana, for your question. So we have time for one last question from the audience. So if you have any, now's the time. no other questions from the audience? You sure? All right then.
That
yes.
probably concludes my presentation.
Yeah, I think so too, Ruslan. Yes. So I would like to reiterate the thanks to you, Ruslan, and for a great presentation, and everyone also in the audience. I hope that you enjoyed it as much as I did.